Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to, again, just look at things from a slightly different perspective, to look beyond our own boundaries, beyond our own perspectives, and allow you to speak from other places. And Father, while we know your truth is centered in your word and through your Christ, we also understand we live in a world that believes otherwise. And in our desire to love our neighbor, we know that we must at least listen to our neighbor and try to understand where he or she is coming from. And so, Father, our desire today is just to listen and hear what other people are saying so that we can re-examine our faith and be strengthened in the reasons why we believe the way we believe. And so, Father, we just ask that this time of reflection and thinking about others would be productive spiritually in our lives. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, we come now to a separate topic. We've discussed to this point religions that have emerged out of India, with Hinduism and Buddhism. Both of those faiths come out of India and then spread across the world. Buddhism especially spread across the world and taking stronghold, especially in China and in Japan. And so we've walked through that story of development. But there's another wave of religious thought that emerges out of China itself. And we want to talk about that kind of strand of thought as it developed over the centuries, realizing that as time went on, these native religious traditions out of China will merge with Buddhism, and there becomes kind of a synergy and a contrast and a pulling together and a merging in some cases and a self-definition in other cases where these various traditions come together. And so a lot of times in Asia you'll see kind of a mixture of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. They kind of go together. And so we're going to kind of look at those kind of traditions that emerge out of China and later get merged and discussed and defined as it intersects with Buddhism. So those two traditions are traditionally known as Taoism and Confucianism. So we're going to look at those tonight and see how far we get. And again, given the time that we have, we're going to have to do very top layer here, very superficial, but at least it'll give you an idea of essentials and basics with regard to these two traditions. We're going to start with some preliminary considerations, then we'll look at Taoism, and then we'll look at Confucianism in that order. Just some preliminary considerations, as always. What are the challenges to understanding a particular tradition, especially these Chinese traditions of Taoism and Confucianism? Well, the first thing we run into right away is we talk about whether these are philosophies or religions. Neither one of these are religion in the traditional sense. That is, we're not talking about gods here. We're not talking about salvation here. We're not talking so much about prophets and revelation. So on one level, we're talking about philosophies, and both of these approaches are discussed in philosophical curriculums in various universities. So not so much as religion, but as philosophies. However, at the same time, as these traditions develop, the founders themselves may be thinking more in terms of philosophy and approach to life. But as these traditions develop, they become religious traditions. That is, there are temples, there are places of worship, there are rituals of worship, there are beliefs about deities of some sort. And so while they may have started as philosophy, they grow and merge into religion, and now they kind of have both personalities. And so it is possible to think of them as philosophies, and some people do that. That is, I have people I know that consider themselves Christian Taoists or Christian Confucianists. That is, they think their faith is Christian and their philosophy is over here. I don't know that that's necessarily consistent, but they feel that it's not inconsistent. They don't embrace the religious aspect of these traditions, but they embrace the philosophical traditions. I'll leave it up to you to decide that. But in terms of the way it develops historically, it is both. It starts off more or less as a philosophical tradition, but keep in mind, in these ancient traditions, there's not a clear distinction between religion and philosophy. It's all part of one life form. You remember when we first started off talking about religion, we talked about how in the indigenous religious traditions, there was no separate category called religion. There's just life that is imbued with all this spiritual reality. It's just part of what life is. And that's certainly the case in the Chinese tradition as well. That the spiritual nature of life, the ancestors, the spirits, they're just a part of what you deal with. And so in their mind, there isn't a clean-cut division between religion and philosophy. It's just life, including all the spiritual dimension that you have. So it's kind of a Western thing to say, is it philosophy or religion? In a native kind of traditional Chinese mindset, it's both and it always will and it always must be, because that is just life. That is, obviously, we're talking about previous to a communist tradition that tried to take all that stuff out. And then a separate challenge we have is, I've hinted at it a little bit before, we kind of neatly divide this out into Taoism and Confucianism. The truth is, they're not really isms in terms of a closed system. This isn't like a closed system of religion with a hierarchy and people that you must listen to and bishops or popes or directors. There's not that kind of hierarchy or international kind of order where you're in this ism. These are more thought trends. They're belief systems. And as such, they can intermingle and overlap. And so, as I said before, throughout history, people may have seen themselves as kind of following Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism and kind of seeing overlaps between them, not feeling the necessity to choose this religion or that religion. It's more different influences in how you pull this together and your different traditions, how you think through things. And there may be strands from the various schools of thought mixed into your personal view. So it's kind of hard for us to talk about Taoism as a religion and say, here are the Taoists that have this organization, this institution. It doesn't really exist like that. There are Taoist temples, but often you'll see Taoism and Confucianism mixed in the same buildings. So there's a lot of blurring that goes on here. So we're going to kind of talk about Taoism and Confucianism separately, but the fact is they overlap, and there's some intermixture in terms of people believing. And for that reason, one of the other challenges, we don't really know. In the last couple of religions we went through, I started off with a little slide that says, here's a rough estimate of where these people are and how many there are. The truth is, we have no idea how many Taoists there are in the world. We really don't know how many Confucianists there are in the world. Estimates range all the way from 2 or 3 million up to 9 or 10 million. I mean, we really don't know because, again, it's not an organized religion with a base that you can count noses. It's just people self-identify as one or the other, and sometimes both. So, notwithstanding all that, they do have separate lines of influence, separate traditions, separate trajectories, and so we're going to look at those today and maybe distinguish a little bit some of those trends and give you a familiarity with some of the concepts that are there. So we start off with Taoism, and the founder of Taoism is a person by the name of Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, depending, again, various translations. Part of the problems now when you get into Chinese is you're not really going from an alphabetic language to an alphabetic language. Chinese is a picture language. So how do you render Chinese into an alphabet? And how do you render it into an English alphabet? And there have been a couple different traditions about how to do that over history. And so as a result, when you're doing research on the history of Chinese religion, you have to kind of be a little bit flexible in terms of spelling and in some cases even pronunciation, because of the two different ways, in fact, and variations of those two different ways of taking Chinese characters and rendering them into English alphabet. So you'll see different spellings of the founder's name. We don't know a lot about Lao Tzu. The traditions, some people place him between the 6th and 5th centuries, some people place him a little later, and some modern scholars doubt that the man ever existed in the first place. So we don't have a lot of hard, concrete data about this. Our first kind of biographies come, again, several hundred years after his life, and we're not sure how much of that is tradition, how much of that is passed down, how ancient these things are. The full kind of biography, a lot of the stuff is taken is probably from about 100 BC. So again, 5 centuries after his birth or 4 centuries after his birth, we have the first records of his birth, which is challenging. And those of us in the Christian tradition like to point out how quickly after Jesus' death these manuscripts are available. Within 100 years of his death, we already have gospels and accounts of the life of Jesus. Here we're waiting some 400 or 500 years before we get the first account of Lao Tzu. And for that reason, as I said, some scholars even doubt that the person existed. And obviously the picture that I have of him up there is not a photograph. That is just an artistic recommendation from a text that was written in the 19th century, but I believe, just artistic representations of these folks. So he's known as the founder, and the tradition, the stories, there's several different stories about how he came to the place of kind of founding this faith. One is that he was in dialogue with Confucius, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, and how it was really in a dialogue with Confucius that he kind of comes up with a different way of thinking. So that's one tradition. The one that is repeated more often, though, says that it comes from a story of him being a leader or an official, an archivist in a library during a period in Chinese history where the leadership began to start falling apart. And he became more and more frustrated as a government employee. I'm sure none of you can identify, right? Working for a government, feeling like the government is starting to slowly fall apart. I'm sure none of you can empathize with any of that. But he's feeling that his government job is just getting more and more frustrating as he sees his country kind of go downhill. And so he decides to check out, and he rides off into the west. And so the story goes, he gets to the boundary just about where he's leaving China. And before he goes, a gatekeeper asks him why he's leaving. And so he tells the story, and the gatekeeper says, "Before you go, tell me your thoughts, write them down." And so the story goes that Lao Tzu wrote down his thoughts about why he was leaving and what is the problem with our country and how do we move forward. And he penned this book on the spot that we now know as the Tao Te Ching. And so Lao Tzu is kind of seen as the founder of the Taoist position because he is the one that produced the foundational text called the Tao Te Ching. And again, it's spelled different ways depending upon which kind of English translation project you use. Sometimes Tao is spelled with a D. I chose the one that's more popular with the T, Tao. But sometimes it's written as all one word, Tao Te Ching. But this is the manifesto of what Lao Tzu is saying, and it becomes the basis of what we now know as Taoism. So one of the famous statements from the Tao Te Ching, and by the way, on this title, what does that mean? Well, the Tao, as we're going to see, is kind of a foundational Chinese concept. We're going to talk about what that means, but it was been around since before Lao Tzu. This is an ancient concept that's been around, the Tao as an idea. And so what Lao Tzu is saying, what is this Tao? What is it? And various people debate how to translate this into English. Different translations have been proposed. Probably the most accurate, the word Jing, is talking about classic, a classic book. Tao is sometimes translated way, although people will debate that translation. Te is kind of virtue. So maybe the best way to translate this is the classic work on the Tao and virtue, or the classic work on the way and virtue. It is essentially telling us this is an attempt to explain what is life all about. What is the point of life? What is the way that is in the universe? And how are we supposed to live with it and go with it? And so Lao Tzu in this work is telling us about what this Tao is. And so he makes this statement. He says, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. In other words, he's saying to us that there's a sense in which this is beyond speech, beyond recognition. It's not a concept that we can even talk about. It goes beyond our mental abilities. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. In other words, we have to talk about it. We have to give it a name. We have to discuss it. But we have to understand that the Tao, what's behind all this, is beyond what we can name. It's beyond what we can talk about. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. So those are the opening lines in the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching. It's going to tell us what is this power? What is this thing? What is this classic that's been around in Chinese thought? How are we supposed to understand that as we move forward? And keeping in mind that his point was that what was happening in his own culture, it wasn't being followed correctly. It wasn't being understood correctly. That's why he had to leave his job. That's why the country is falling apart. They really didn't understand what the Tao is and how we ought and what it is not. And he goes on to saying, look, it's bigger than you and I. It's beyond us. So what is this Tao then, this Tao Te Ching, and what is this Tao that he's writing about that's at the heart of this faith we call Taoism? Well, here's one definition from a practitioner that I think is a pretty good, understandable one. I mean, there's all kinds of attempts to explain what is the Tao. Here's one that I think we can grasp and get a hold of, and this is from somebody that's inside the tradition, so it's not like we're taking our Western ideas and forcing it into the understanding. This is somebody, a practitioner, what they think this Tao is. So again, the Tao, or pronounced Tao, literally means the path or the way. That's one English translation of it. But here he says it's a universal principle that underlies everything from the creation of galaxies to the interaction of the human beings. The workings of Tao are vast and often beyond human comprehension. In order to understand it, reasoning alone will not suffice. One must also apply intuition. In other words, what he's saying here is the Tao is what lies behind everything. It's what holds everything together. It's beyond being. It's beyond creation. It's not the creator. It's not God. The Tao is not a thing or a person or even a force. It's something beyond all that. It is why it is just the essence of everything that's beyond description, beyond discussion even. It can't be talked about clearly. You can't say what it is, except you know that something is in back of all things. It is the way of things. It works itself from beyond. It works its way through all of us and through all of nature. It is that out of which the universe came, that out of which being came, but it was not a creator. It's not a God. It's just a reality. It just is what it is. And it's been around forever. It didn't start at any particular time. It's always just been there. And so the essence of the Tao Te Ching is, how do we live with this force? I mean, it is. It's not, you can't argue about it. You can't discuss it. You can't debate it. It just is. So how do you live with it? How do you move with it? How do you live in concert with it? So you kind of have to accept it, but people don't live in accordance with it, according to Lao Tzu. So what do we have to do to live in accordance with this universal thing or force or idea, which is neither a force nor a thing nor an idea? It just is, and you must live with it, whatever it might be. And so that's really like Buddhism, it's a very practical religion or a very practical faith. Remember, we said Buddha didn't spend a lot of time worrying about creation or gods or how this thing came in order. It didn't matter to him. The only problem to Buddha was suffering. Well, in a similar way, Tao, it's not really about where the Tao come from or where I came from or all the logic behind that. It is. You just accept it. It's more about how you deal with it, how you live with it, how you live in concert with it. And it's because people don't live in concert with the Tao or with the Tao that we have all these problems. That the country is falling apart in his mind, that people's lives are falling apart. They're not living in accordance with the Tao. So what do you have to do? How do you live in accordance with this force, this thing, this reality that none of us can talk about, this Tao? Well, that's debated heavily. It's hard to talk about and it's hard to discuss, but commentators have walked through, and again, from someone inside the tradition, as they seek to explain what it means to live in accordance with the Tao, here are some principles that you kind of have to get a hold of and understand and accept if you're going to live in accordance with this reality. The first is the principle of non-contention. See, the idea is the Tao flows, it just is. And what happens sometimes is we think that you got to fight and you got to struggle and you got to push back against stuff. You have to force. But the truth is that the Tao, you're not going to fight it. You're not going to break it that way. You can't. It's not a matter of pushing back and fighting. You have to go with it. You just have to go with it. You can't push back. You can't fight it. It's a thing that you will not turn back. It's kind of like a river that is flowing, and you don't like where the river's going, so you try to put a wall up and make the river go another way, and the river just keeps going and going. Eventually it breaks down the wall and it goes where it wants to go. You just can't. You got to go with it. So all this kind of life that you find yourself in contention and fighting back and pushing back and resisting and pushing hard, that's not the way of the Tao, according to Lao Tzu. There's a going with it kind of thing. You just got to go with it. You create so much stress in your life by just fighting against what is, fighting against one another, fighting against the government, fighting against whatever it is. You have to develop a thought that you just kind of go with the Tao. It's not about fighting. You have to just go with whatever the force is taking you, whatever the Tao is going, whatever that way, whatever that path. You just have to go with it. And along with that is this idea that's kind of pivotal to the whole Taoist idea, is this idea of Wu Wei, non-action. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do in Lao Tzu's is not to work so hard at something, to try so hard. You kind of have to relax and just do what comes naturally. If you just relax and do what comes naturally, you'll find that you can get through the tough stuff of life. When you try so hard and work so hard and strain so hard to achieve your goals, when you drive yourself that way, you create this tension in yourself that it becomes kind of a weakness. The strongest thing to do is to go with it. To go with it. You can see why Taoism functions a lot in martial arts. It's the idea that you just go with the movement. You take the flow. You kind of read what the other person is doing, use their strength to get them, use a minimal and economy of effort. That's why it's one of my favorite religions, It's an economy of effort. I bought my wife one of those little Fitbit things, and she's always every day counting how many steps she does, and she gives me a report of how many thousands of steps she does. And she told me she wanted to get me one, and I said, that won't work for me because I try to do the reverse, see how close to zero I could keep it on any given day, you know what I mean? So I love this part of Taoism, that it's a minimal of effort. You don't have to fight it. You just kind of go with it. And that becomes one of the strongest things you can do. So it's not a negative thing as you're lazy and you just sit on the couch. That's not what Taoism is about. It's about the fact that sometimes you try so hard and you're weakening yourself by trying so hard. You got to learn how to go with it. and kind of go with the flow and go with what's happening and use the forces that are out there to empower what you're doing. So economy of effort. That's the idea. And the same thing happens with regard to non-intention. The argument there is that you should do these things by nature. See, if you try really hard to become famous or try really hard to become great, and try really hard to become rich, or try even really hard to do something well, you want to do a charitable thing and you want to try to do the good thing. It's as if you're not that and you want to try really hard to do that. And he's saying there's no virtue there. You should be at the place where you just do things naturally. It should just flow out of you. You should be naturally good, naturally charitable, naturally smart, naturally wise. You should get to the place in Taoism where it's all just kind of comes out of you. You don't have to like say, I am not this, I want to be that. So it's not like you're trying to be anything. You're just being who you are. So this idea of just kind of letting yourself be yourself. Don't fight it. That's his idea. Now, that doesn't mean give in to all your selfish ambitions and just be, just satiate your own desires. No, because that's not the way of the Tao. The way of the Tao is a good thing. You're supposed to give in to the way of the Tao that's working you, and the way of the Tao is a way of productivity and a way of charity and a way of goodness. So you want to go with that. Also, the same thing with regard to simplicity. We overcomplicate things. We build layers on top of things. We stratify things. There's a president and a vice president and a secretary. And there's 15 bosses and 15 structures in the government. Why? Because everybody wants to be the top guy, that's why. And we're trying to pile on. And he's like, the simplest way is often the best way. Right? I had a plumbing issue in my house. And I decided that I need to fix this plumbing issue by myself because that's what a man's supposed to do in his house. So I went out and I got all the special plumbing wrench that you need, and I crawled up under the sink and I reached up there and unscrewed the thing because there was a dripping faucet. It all started with a dripping faucet. And so I'm like unscrewing the thing, taking it all apart. I make it, and it's, you got to reach it here and go there, and I'm laying on my back, and my back is in pain, and I do it anyway, and I drop the thing on my head, and I'm going through all this stuff to take apart my sink to figure out what's wrong. I take it all apart, replace a part, put it all back together. That was painful. Hours later, I put it all back together, and the sink still drips. So I call my friend John, who's a plumber. He comes over and looks at it and goes like this and says, "You need a new faucet." It was like 30-second job. So that's called in simplicity. Sometimes the simple is the best. If you have the knowledge, if you know the way, if you're enriched in the Tao, you don't have to work hard. It's simple. It's those of us who don't know what we're doing that have to work hard, that make it complicated. The simple is the smartest. It's the people that know the Tao, that it's straightforward. It's simple. It's not hard. We overcomplicate things. That's the view of Taoism. And another one is humility. That's another teaching that comes out of the Tao Te Ching. We human beings, we try to make this big deal about ourselves, like it's all about us and it's all about me. Well, in Taoism, it's not all about you. You're just part of the system. You're just part of this cosmic reality, this interplay of things. You're just one among many things that are going on here. It's why often in Asian art, there's, in Western art, it's the big picture of the big person right in the middle doing the big thing. And sometimes in Asian art, mostly, not always, but mostly you see the scenery and the river and the tree, and then the guy's over there in the corner just doing something. You're not even sure because they're just part of the bigger picture. So there's this idea in Taoism that it's not all about you. It's about everything going on around you and within everybody else. This is all one big system that all kind of works together. And you just got to go with it, be a part of it. And that leads us to this other concept of the yin and the yang. And you've seen the symbol before of the yin and the yang. And it's, again, you find it in Taoism. You also find it in other places from Asian thought. It's the idea that this world is complementary in some way. That the opposite forces, they're necessary, they're essential. Life and death, light and darkness, masculine and feminine, even and odd. These things are necessary for this system to go together. And in fact, you'll see the two little dots in this symbol, the black dot in the middle of the white and the white dot in the middle of the black. That tells us that even within these forces are little bits of each other. And so the reality is, in this world, you have to embrace both, the positive and the negative, the up and the down, the push and the pull. It's all part of this one without the other. They just kind of emerge together. They require each other. And so that's part of going with it. You know, our Western mindset says push back on one side. We're about the push side, and we just need to force our way in. And the idea is, no, you have to go with it, the good and the bad, the positive and the negative, the up and the down. You just have to flow with it. It's all part of the necessary function of life. Which, this totally blows our Western minds, because in our Western minds, it's all about cause and effect. It's all about Newtonian science. It's like there has to be the first domino to fall down to the next domino, and the next domino. There has to be a beginning. There has to be a creator. There has to be a start. Somebody had to do the first thing. And in Taoist thought, there doesn't have to be a first thing because they arise together. It's a simultaneous kind of immersion of the opposites. There doesn't have to be a first anything. It just kind of came up together. This complementary nature of both sides. And so this idea that it takes both. It takes male and female. And all the other opposites, light and dark, north and south, shady and sunny. It takes all those opposites to make a world. And if we're going to learn to live with that Tao, we're going to have to just go with it. And so you see the picture here is somebody who understands the way of the Tao to such a deep, deep level that they just kind of go through life and they find power from just going through it. And they just kind of find a quiet confidence and a strength. That's why you ever notice you watch some of those old Asian movies and the martial arts guy is always chill. You know what I mean? Like nothing upsets the chill guy. It's because he's just going with it. He just goes with the flow. Nothing surprises him. So that's kind of the ideal that's behind the Tao Te Ching, behind Lao Tzu. Well, obviously we barely touched the surface of this text, and there's all kinds of translations out there. It might be interesting for you to go out and read some of that. In my course, I asked them to read a piece of this because, again, it's for us Westerners who are used to thinking one way. It's very interesting to think how another culture views all this. Well, if we go on a couple hundred years or 100 years, depending on when you date Lao Tzu, the next kind of critical person in the development of Taoism is a fellow by the name of Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is an interesting character. Again, we don't know a lot historically about him. Folks variously talk about his interaction with Confucius and so forth. So not a lot of history about the man himself. More emphasis is placed upon this book, also called Zhuangzi. And so you can look it up and you'll see sometimes it refers to the person, sometimes it refers to the book. And Zhuangzi, his book, we don't really have the original. We have edited versions that come centuries later, boiled down to, I think, 33 chapters is where they ended it up. And so it's just a teaching about Zhuangzi starting out with the concepts of the Tao Te Ching and Lao Tzu, but refining it in his own particular way. And where Zhuangzi was coming at it, again, in this period of time where the society was again falling apart, he was trying to teach that concept of not just going with it, but this idea of humility in the face of all this change. See, what happens in these warring periods where all these battle lines are drawn? People get out there and they start drawing these hard lines about right and wrong. We're in a political season now. We haven't seen that at all, have we? This side is right, this side is wrong, this side's going to heaven, this side's going to hell, right? Everybody's drawing the lines, calling each other names. And Zhuangzi lived in that period of time where everybody's pointing fingers at one another, drawing these hard lines of who was right and who was wrong, and always warring with one another. And he's like, time out. Everybody just stop for a minute and think. And he uses his Taoist kind of teaching to begin to re-examine how do we view the world, and where do we think we know all this stuff? Why do we think we have all these answers? It was a challenge to us fundamentalists, we fundamentalists who think we know all the answers. He's pushing back to the fundamentalists of his day, saying, just stop for a moment. So for an example, and the Zhuangzi, you read through it, and honestly, it's just a delightful read, because I read through it, and half the time I don't even know what he's talking about. You're trying to read these things, and it's filled with humor, filled with all kinds of jokes. I mean, he's often, it's the madman telling the wise men the truth, and Confucius shows up in this. He makes a lot of appearances, and he and Confucius are arguing about different stuff. It's just a delightful book to read, and you just kind of get these stories, and it makes you kind of stop oftentimes and say, wow, I have no idea what that means. But that's the point. That's what he wants you to do. He wants you to stop and say, yeah, I have no idea what this means. Because his whole point is, you don't know what it means. You don't know what anything means. You got to step back, have a little humility here. That's the way it is. And so, here's one of the famous stories there is from the Zhuangzi. He falls asleep and he has a dream that he's a butterfly. And the butterfly's flying around, and he's just seeing himself as a butterfly floating all around. And then he wakes up, and he remembers this dream of a butterfly. Or am I a butterfly that's dreaming I'm Zhuangzi? You see, we assume we're awake and we're doing the dreaming. We're convinced of that, but are you really? Maybe somebody somewhere is sleeping right now dreaming that you're here in a world religions class. Are you here? Are you asleep somewhere else dreaming that you're in a world religions class? Or would you call it a nightmare? I don't know, which we'll have to see. And so, how do you really know whether you're here or not here, whether this is real or not real, whether it's a dream or reality? Zhuangzi is just pushing on you to say, look, do you really have all the answers? Really? Maybe you ought to step back and think a little bit. That's kind of the drive. So what are the essential teachings of this particular text? Well, the first thing we have to understand is embrace, again, it's right out of Tao. So you start with this idea that Tao is the source of heaven and earth. And so this Tao that's just beyond everything, that Tao, it runs through everything that is. And it's really at the source of this flux of heaven and earth. And so all this change that you're fighting against, all this, you're trying to stop time, you're trying to stop movement, you're trying to stop all this stuff. Do you understand that all that flux, to and fro, come and go, weather changes, change, developments, it's all part of the Tao. The Tao breathes change into this world. Change is one of the hardest things to accept because we like things to stay the same. We don't like it when they take our hymn books away. We're used to those hymn books. We don't like it when they move our furniture and change the colors. Zhuangzi is saying, look, you got to go with it. You can't be afraid of the flux of heaven and earth, the cold to the warm, the height to the depth, the storm to the calm. You got to go with change. You can't fight against it. So understanding that a lot of our frustration, a lot of our anger, and a lot of our passion comes from the resistance of the new. We don't like what's new, and so we get angry. And he's saying, The Tao is the source of this flux and this change. It moves. The river changes every day. There's new water in there. It goes in different directions. The tree sprouts new leaves and dies and comes back next year with new leaves entirely. There's a newness and a freshness and a change to life, and you got to go with it. Stop trying to stop change, because that doesn't work. And then he pressed back the second level, and I think I hinted on it before. The result of all this a kind of desire to stay where we are is that you put together this language of division. We categorize things, right? And we're always thinking our view and our language about things. That's absolute truth. That's absolute falsity. So, again, we're in the political season, so you're a liberal, you're conservative, and we know exactly what that means. We put people in these categories, and we think that's what it is. Or we tell a person you're a male and you're a female, and therefore we know what that means. We have a preconceived notion. And so language itself has this way of imposing your definition of reality on what it is you see. And we just assume that as human beings, that we have that power, that right to just impose our language and say that's reality. Zhuangzi says who? Says why? Like, what is your language that's going to impose this on things? Well, let me just offer a Christian comment, because every once in a while I need to remind you that I am a Christian. The Word speaks. Jesus speaks. The Word was made flesh. God speaks. So our belief is that words mean something. They're representative of what is. If God uses those words, if God sends His Son as a word, then there is words that represent reality. God did it. God chose to communicate in that way. So we would not necessarily agree with this particular perception. We'd push back on that as a Christian. But we can learn a little bit and realize that sometimes even we Christians, we start adopting this language as if we know what we're talking about. Are you a Christian? No, I mean a real Christian. I mean, are you a born-again Christian? Okay, what does that mean, right? Are you an evangelical Christian? Are you a conservative Christian? We want to put people in categories. So we can learn a little bit here from Zhuangzi about, let's be careful about our languages if we can impose reality on somebody. Just because you can say it doesn't mean it's true. There's also this emphasis in Zhuangzi on finding your own way through this. Not insisting that everybody do things the same way you do it. There may be other ways to figure this out. Your interpretation of the Tao and how you go with the Tao, it might not be everybody's interpretation. You got to be flexible about how everybody kind of finds their own way to work with the Tao in the world. You got to be open to other things. Of course, you put back on him and say, well, why is your way the right way then? As long as why do you get to? And he would agree with you. He said, yeah, you're probably right. I'm not telling you the truth. You got to figure it out. So there's this idea that, again, in a society where all these people are saying my way or the highway, he's saying chill. Everybody can kind of go with the Tao in a different way. You got to figure out your own path here. That would be his pushback. And he would push on too, saying, look, in this duality, this right and wrong, left and right, there's a unity to be achieved here. That the two are part of the one Tao. You have to understand that opposites doesn't mean one is out and one is in. You got to figure out how these two things go together. So the rich and the poor, you got to figure out how to make one family out of that. So instead of ostracizing and separating and saying, you're out, I'm in, I hate you because you're not me, instead of creating those lines of division, you got to understand that there's different perspectives, we've got to find a way to unify those. That's all part of the Tao. The opposites are part of the one thing. And the last thing, see, this tells you he's actually a Tea Party candidate here. It's the futility of government. See, now all of a sudden you're Zhuangzi fans, right? It's this idea that government messes things up. This was not always a popular thing to say when you were in the kingdom, the ancient Chinese world. But the idea is that government was a problem because the government tried to impose its language and its will on all the people and try to tell you what the Tao is and how you ought to live in accordance with the Tao. And so there's this kind of rebelliousness about Taoism that says, no, you don't tell me what to do. I flow. This is like the hippie version. We're just going to flow here. You can't tell me what to do. And so there's this little bit of a rascally kind of edge to Taoism that it's kind of for the senior citizens of a culture. See, the younger people, they always have to follow the rules, right? They have to go to work. They have to go there because if they don't, the boss will fire them. And they got to follow all the rules and have the household. But those of us that are a little older, we're in retirement. Who's going to tell us what to do? What are you going to do, fire me? I'm retired, right? So you can say whatever you want. Do you notice that, folks? You get a little older, you can say whatever you want. What are they going to say to you? Right? So there's that little rascally side of Taoism that says, you don't tell me anything. Like, I'm figuring this out. I'm just going to go with the flow. I'm going to make up my own path here. And so government, don't be coming along and tell me who I have to be. And so there's this kind of anti-establishment theme that runs through Taoism, which, not surprisingly, did not go well all the time politically for the Taoists. Throughout the history in China, from time to time, there was long periods where emperors would round up all the Taoist books and try to burn them, because it was considered seditious, plots against the government. You have to listen to the emperor, So Taoism always kind of has that anti-establishment kind of side to it, and it's part of the humor that you find. And that's one of the tensions in the Zhuangzi when you read through, and he's having this arguments with Confucius, because Confucius was always trying to argue for the status quo and following the rules. Well, lastly, we have this side of Taoism. About the 2nd century AD, you began to make this journey from a life approach to a religion. You have this individual, Zhang Daoling, and he comes along and he claims to have had a vision from Lao Tzu. That Lao Tzu has kind of passed on, and he receives a vision, and he considered himself now to be the first celestial master, and he creates this celestial master school of folks that follow along. And the idea is that they now developed Taoism as a religion, as a focus, and so now they began to get pulled into this idea that it's a devotion to these teachings, a devotion to these masters that have gone before. And so it's with Daoling that you begin to see this transition from philosophy to religion. In fact, it's during this particular position that Lao Tzu becomes considered a deity. He's actually passed on. Now, not a god like you and I would consider a god that we worship, but rather an ancestor that has gone on and is now showing us the way and showing us the path. He's an ancestor. And remember, in Asian thought from the very beginning, the idea was you always adored or you always venerated your ancestors. When they passed on, it was not death. It was just transition to another life plane. And so you continue to worship and reverence your ancestors. You burn incense to them. You burn money and give them money in their heavenly economy. So you do a lot of things to take care of them when they're gone on. You still respect them and follow them. So the whole idea is, the ancestors continue. Well, now, Taoism kind of picks up on this, and certain of these ancestors, like Lao Tzu, it becomes kind of this grand master, the celestial master that's kind of moved on and you venerate him. And you have this listing of the eight immortals, folks that have gone on, Taoists that have gone forward, and they have them named. And so you have temples where you can go where the eight immortals are listed, and you worship them the way you would worship other ancestors. And you have the three pure ones out there that become kind of another version, though not God or Trinity like you and I would think of it, but it's in some cases it's this idea that there are these kind of beings out there that have been powerful influences in the history of the world. Again, the Tao is still beyond all this. The Tao is above gods, it's beyond gods, it's unknowable, and yet out of this, these deities come and provide guidance to us. And we won't have time to go into this, but there are other schools that develop and go on in different directions of Taoism, and that's in your notes if you want to go and look that up and have a lot of follow-up with that. But many, many different incarnations, if you will, of Taoism, some of which receive the support of the state, but many of which do not, right? And so that's part of the challenge of Taoism. And of course, we can't talk about Taoism without talking about the Tao of Pu, right? That's very important. How many of you read the Tao of Pu in college? At one point, it was a textbook in college. That was the highlight of our American educational system. You had to read the Tao of Pu in college. But yeah, Winnie the Pooh, Benjamin Wolf put together this amazing thing, and he uses the different characters in the Winnie the Pooh stories to illustrate Eastern thought, and it was very entertaining and interesting. But you can't talk about Taoism in America without talking about the Tao of Pu. So there you go. I passed that part of the test. Okay. Looking at my time here, we need to move forward and talk a little about Confucianism and move on from there. So, all right. So, and I think I said his name was Wolf. I think it's Hoff, though. Benjamin Hoff is his name. I don't know why I said Wolf. Okay, Confucianism. Now we're going to turn the channel and talk about the other sides. Now, we have these two kind of movements that go on side by side. Taoism over on the one side, and sometimes when this topic is covered, you do Confucianism first and then Taoism. I chose to do Taoism first and Confucian only because according to some traditions, Lao Tzu lived before Confucius. Again, that's speculation. Nobody really knows. Maybe they were contemporaries. Maybe Lao Tzu came after. We're not really sure. There's not enough historical data to say. Except we do know that Taoism and Confucianism represented two different themes in Chinese history about this time. There is this one interpretation of reality that says, go with nature. Just go with nature. Figure it out and go with nature. That's Taoism. And then you have the other side that says, no, there's got to be some order. There's got to be some structure. Somebody's got to get control of this mess. And that's the Confucian side. So you have these two pulling tendencies in Asian thought between the go with nature side and the go with structure side. And one is Taoism and the other is Confucianism. So obviously when you want to talk about who founded Confucianism, this is a very important question on the test. Who is the founder of Confucianism? I hope we can all get that right. That's Confucius. Right? That's one of those Jay Leno questions they used to go out and ask college students. Who's the founder of Confucianism? And see if they could get it right. But it's Confucius. Again, various names depending upon the way that you spell it and render it into English. That's kind of, and again, the problem of that version, Confucius, some people blame that on the Catholics and the Jesuits. They took the Chinese word and rendered it into this Latin form called Confucius. But like it or not, that's what most people know him as, and so that's what he's spoken as. Now again, Confucius was an interesting character, born like Lao Tzu, born in kind of an area of authority, but kind of a tutor for folks, kind of a tutor in a royal or at least a government household. And he spent his life just believing that people should learn what it is he had to say. He was very convinced of his philosophy and his way, but during his lifetime, nobody listened to him. He was kind of a failure during his time. Nobody listened to him. And he was very frustrated because he was being raised at a time where things were changing, and it wasn't like the good old days of the dynasty that he grew, that was previous dynasty. It wasn't this wonderful place where everything kind of worked well. We were now in a period of decline, and he longed for the noble gentleman leader that used to be in charge of the country. What happened to those good old days when the good leaders led? Now we have chaos and brokenness and everybody fighting one another, and he just wanted to get back to the glory days, the golden age. But nobody would listen to him. But that was kind of his thought and his desire. How can we create, and he saw in these young people he had to put together, they just weren't learning how to be what they should be. And so his desire was to bring us back to a golden age where the gentleman ruler was in place. So he's kind of the founder, but that's kind of the origin of where he comes from. Again, like Lao Tzu, it's really sometime later, 100 years or 150 years later, till you have other folks that come along and kind of institutionalize or codify what Confucius says and what he means. You probably may have heard of this person, Mencius. He was 4th century, 3rd century, end of the 3rd century, 4th century BC person that kind of codified and put into more concrete form. We have another fellow by the name of Zunzi, and I'm speeding through all this to what should be a much longer talk, but I'm keeping an eye on our time. But just to give you some names out there as you walk through. Zhang Shu is very important here. He's very important because he takes kind of the Confucian thought and turns it into a codified thought that you and I know about. Here's this quote I pulled from one of the scholars that says, without Kongzi or without Confucius, there would be no Confucianism, but without Dong, there would be no Confucianism, and it has been known for the past 2,000 years. In other words, he was the official interpreter of what did Confucius say. So very important, 100 years or so before Christ, laying out what it is that Confucius really taught. And so what that means then is we have these, throughout this period, there are various works that were put together that really form the basis of what Confucianism is. And so let me kind of just give you a quick overview of what those texts were. Some of them, you start off with what's called the 5 classics, sometimes the 6 classics. Now, these were actually works that were probably around before Confucius. Classic books that come out of the classic age of Chinese literature and Chinese thought. And Confucius really saw himself as an interpreter of these works. In other words, he didn't really think he was coming up with anything new. He didn't think he was inventing a new philosophy or certainly not a new religion. He just felt he was trying to take us back to what the original truths were, these great works that were around from the very beginning. And he just wants to kind of comment on them and explain them and reassert them in his own day and age. And so to really understand Confucius, so the scholars say, you've got to go back and begin to really analyze some of these old works, because in his mind, he was just explaining these ancient classics, or like I said, sometimes a 6th classic is added, but typically it's 5. And then sometime later, much later actually, what gets codified, and we're really now well into the modern era, maybe even the 13th century, 12th century, you get codified what's called the 4 books of Confucianism. And there's kind of 4 levels. The first is the one you're most familiar with, perhaps if you know anything about Confucianism. It's called the Analects. It's the teaching of Confucius, at least as it's rendered and put together. So you remember the old movies where you heard Confucius say. Remember those old movies where they told you what Confucius say? They're quoting from the Analects. This is the sayings of Confucius recording. And then beyond that, we have the book of Mencius, again, another formative teacher, and a couple other works in this regard that are kind of viewed as the 4 books that are the foundation for Confucianism. So it's just kind of, for the fun of it, let's look at a couple quotes from Confucius from the Analects to see if we can get a picture of maybe what Confucius is saying and what he means. He says, the master said, and by the master we're talking about, these are quotes from Confucius, these are recollections, so this is a student remembering what the master said, what Confucius said. The master said, I will not be afflicted at men's not knowing me. I will be afflicted that I do not know men. In other words, the idea is, it's not about me. You see a theme here? It's not about me. Like, I don't really care if people remember me. Which, as I said, it kind of worked out because nobody knew who he was in his lifetime. That's got to be a tough life when you become famous, but you don't become famous till after you're dead. That doesn't help a lot, does it? Well, that's Confucius. He's like, but he said that's part of his thinking. Like, it doesn't matter whether people know me. It only matters whether I know them. My job is to know them. So there's a great deal of humility, just like there was in Taoism. In Confucianism, there's that same degree of humility. It's not about me. And then here's another quote that kind of talks a little bit about what it means to exercise government. The master said, he who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the north polar star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn toward it. One of the ideas behind Confucius' teaching is that real leaders don't have to exert their authority. They don't have to pound the pulpit and yell at everybody. Real leaders have a way of just being that north star that everybody just wants to follow. Does the North Star get up there and say, hey, follow me? No, everybody knows it's a good idea to follow the North Star. If you want to find out where you're going, if you want to know where true north is, look there. Confucius is saying the real government official is a North Star. He doesn't have to get up there and say, follow me. You just know to follow him because it's obvious. The guy knows what he's doing. You ready to cast your vote yet in this year's election? Where's the North Star? Figure it out. Yeah, but that's Confucius' idea that a true leader doesn't have to dictate, doesn't have to force. People would just know this guy knows what he's doing. It's the right. I think, again, just a Christian observation, we would say that's true about Christ. Christ leads as the suffering servant. Someday he'll lead with power and authority, but we're supposed to get the fact that he leads by who he is. Here's another interesting quote. One of his students says, what did you mean? And the master replied, the parents, when alive, be served according to propriety. That when dead, they should be buried according to propriety, and they should be sacrificed to according to propriety. One of the fundamental realities of Confucianism is this respect for the ancestors, respect for tradition. They haven't left you. You still respect them. The idea is that you shouldn't be one way when your parents are alive and a different way when they're dead. If the parent does their job correctly, they should be the same whether you're in the room or not in the room. It's the idea that you respect. Because the truth is, when your parents and your grandparents go on, they don't leave the house. They're there. They're still watching. In the Confucian way of thinking. And so respect for elders, respect for traditions, respect for those who came before. I can tell a lot of you are becoming Confucianists either as we speak here, right? Because of that, you like that idea. So that's part of his thought. So what are the foundational truths of Confucianism, again, as we kind of move through it a little bit quicker than maybe we'd like to. One of the foundational teachings is this idea of Tian. Heaven, nature, divine forces, even gods. There's something from heaven. It's a little more concrete than the Tao. The Tao was this, kind of amorphous undescribable reality that's beyond all things. No, there's something, in Confucianism, there's something a little bit more concrete. It is the Tao expressed for human nature. This is kind of, it means a little bit of the heaven nature, God's whatever it is. It's the will of God for humanity. That's what this Tian is. You're supposed to follow this. This is the will of God for you. But this heaven, and in English it's always just translated heaven. Heaven, in Confucianist thought, it's God's will for, it's the divine will for humanity. We're supposed to do what heaven wants. There's a prescription. It's supposed to work itself out. And by the way, it requires human beings to work it out. That's the role of human beings, to work out the dictates of heaven. That's what human beings are here for. That is, it's not a spirit that actualizes itself. That's not heaven in the Confucius mind. In the Confucian mind, the human being has to actualize heaven. It's our responsibility to actualize heaven. So there's not the concept that you find in Christianity, for example, of a Holy Spirit that implements the kingdom of heaven. No, that's not the way it works in Confucianism. In Confucianism, the human beings have a role and responsibility to execute heaven on earth. That's their responsibility. And there are consequences for all that. If you follow heaven and you do what heaven wants, your kingdom will be productive. It will do the right things. It will produce. There will be health, happiness, wealth. If you do what heaven wants. If you as a leader do what heaven wants. If you violate heaven, there will be consequences for that. Things will not go well if you violate the will of heaven in Confucianism. So the idea is that find out the will of heaven and implement it. Because if you do, as a leader or as an average person, you will experience the blessings of heaven. It's a pretty straightforward concept and orientation. A second concept here at the root of Confucianism is this idea of the Junzi. The Junzi is kind of the goal. He's the scholar administrator. This is the wise leader. And again, this goes back to the glory days. What Confucius thought, this Zhou dynasty, these people were the master leaders. The gentleman scholar. So we have King Wen of Zhou there. He's kind of the archetype. This idea of a noble, superior person dedicated to virtue, scholarly gentleman, perfect human being capable of ruling by moral example, knowledge, love for his subjects. It's the idea of this model leader. Again, this North Star kind of person. So it's not about a dictator that drives his will. It's about this scholar administrator that just knows heaven. And people follow him because they recognize this guy knows heaven. He knows what the will of heaven is. He knows how to implement heaven. And so if we want to follow the ways of heaven, we need to follow the Junzi, the leader. So that's his ideal. So you can see the tension starting to mount between Taoism and Confucianism, right? Taoism's over saying, government's messed up, you want to just go with nature. Whereas Confucianism's saying, no, a really good leader, you need a really good government with this gentleman scholar who just sees things as it ought to be, who declares the way of heaven. So, what does that mean then? Well, how does that all work practically? How does it work itself out in society and in government and in culture? Well, there's these 5 constants that just should underline everything that we do. It's not so much commandments as much as characteristics that just ought to permeate everything that we do, everything that we are. And they're kind of fundamental dictates of heaven. And it's a positive view of humanity. This is something that we can do. We won't necessarily do it automatically. It's not like it's our spirit to do these. We have to work at it, but we all have this potential. Human beings have this potential. They have to live up to the potential to make these things come true, to have the will of heaven executed in the world. The first is humaneness. And that's as good of a kind of an English definition that you can come up with. It talks about the fact that there's this inner awareness of other people, this inner awareness that I'm a human being responsible to other people. There's an otherness about us, an understanding that we're part of, there's a sensitivity to us, a receptiveness to us, this idea that we have a responsibility, that we're part of the larger thing, that we're not an island by ourselves. There's a responsibility to act humanely, to act caringly about one another. It is that fundamental reality. Righteousness, it's it's not so much the biblical definition of God's holiness. It's the right thing, to do the right thing, to do the heavenly thing. There's this idea of doing the right thing in accordance with heaven. Propriety, it ought to be done in the right way. We ought to do it out of love. We ought to do it rightly, but we ought to do it in the right way. There's a proper way to do things. There's a proper way to speak. There's a proper way to give deference to others. There's a proper way to carry out a ritual. There's a proper way to greet and to clean and to do whatever. There's a proper thing. It should be done decently in order. Heaven wants structure, not random chaos. Again, a little difference from Taoism, which you just got to go with all the change. Confucianism, no, there's a propriety, right? Wisdom, the idea of taking this and applying it to everyday life. You should be able to kind of see how to implement the ways of heaven and day to day, and the integrity about it. The idea that who you are on the inside and who you are on the outside are the same person. I don't see any sins listed there. They all seem kind of right to me. But it's in Confucianism. So again, it's this fundamental, the pushback against Confucianism by the Taoists was you're dreaming, dude. This is not reality. You're living in some sort of dream world where this is humanity. But in Confucianism, this is humanity. This is our goal. This is what we should striving for. This was the good old days that we all should go back to. Sometimes in addition to these 5 constants, we have mentioned the 4 virtues, which some cases overlap, but they have a kind of a different twist to them. Loyalty, part of this means you're loyal to the government. You follow what the government, you're loyal to your prince. Now, if you have a bad prince, you're allowed to push back, but if this is all going to work, if heaven's going to work on earth in Confucianism, there's got to be a sense of loyalty to your leaders. You can't just go making this stuff up as you go. It's not every man for himself. You got to follow those who lead well. That's how heaven wants it. And that, along with that is this idea of filial piety. We have to do honor to those who brought us into this world. Our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors, we have a duty to them, and we talked about that before. The idea of self-restraint, you don't get to do everything you want. Taoism was just go with it. Find out what the Tao is in your life and go with it. In Confucianism, no, there's restraint there. You've got to control yourself. You can't just do whatever you feel. There's social obligations here that you have to go through. And then righteousness gets duplicated. Again, you see sometimes the 5 constants, the 4 virtues, they overlap. But the idea is there's this quality to human beings. There's this optimistic view of human beings to do the right thing. I mean, again, as Christians, we look at that and say, where's the sin nature? Where's that? Well, in Confucianism, you just work harder and get over it. You have the potential to beat it, you know? Again, primarily philosophy. Confucius never started off to be a religion. He just wanted to be a philosophy. And what's interesting, too, over the years, it actually became kind of an official religion of the Chinese Empire. You might see why a philosophy like this that says, follow the leader, do what the leader says, everything should be done with structure and order. Well, over time, this becomes the official religion of the Chinese empires. before communism and all the rest. And there was a long period of time there where in order to be a government official with the Chinese dynasty, you had to pass tests. You had to pass tests of Confucianism. There were religious tests you had to take and pass, or philosophy tests you had to. Did you know all these constants and these virtues? You had to pass a test in order to be a civil authority in Confucius government because of the idea. And some people argue that by the time you get to official Confucianism, it wasn't real Confucianism. They had twisted it and turned it in ways that Confucius wouldn't have liked. But nonetheless, for a long period of time, it was the defining religion. Obviously, swept away under communism and experienced a great deal of persecution, actually, with the onslaught of communism in China, but making resurgence now. I say that because one of the holidays in Confucianism that is celebrated is this birthday of Confucius, September 28th. There is this traditional location of his birthplace that you can go and visit and remember, and prayers given there. So there is, again, this transition a little bit from philosophy to more of a religion where you have festivals and pilgrimages, again, making that transition. There's this ancient Chinese festival in the spring, Tomb Sweeping Day. It's this idea of going to the temples and sweeping out your ancestors' temples and tending to their graves. Again, this idea of remembering what came before and taking care of your ancestors in the next life. Again, burning money for them or sending prayers to them. You do this. Also in the fall, there's another, what they call the Ghost Festival, this same idea of celebrating the spirits that are there among you. And that carries off into the home, where there's worship in the home. You can venerate pictures, and the pictures rotate on calendars and so forth, and you have calendars of remembering. It's that filial piety. And also in temples itself. So where you can go into temples and remember these things as well. And lastly, I'll just point out, here's one of the temples of Confucius, where Confucius himself becomes one of those ancestors that you come and worship. All right, well, that was a way too fast gallop through Taoism and Confucianism, but we're about out of time here. So we'll wrap up the talk at this point. We'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll take your questions. Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to dig into history and to dig into other cultures and traditions. And Father, our prayer as always is that you would use these other insights to sharpen our vision of you, who you are, kind of to shock us out and shake us out of our own self-deception and our own arrogance by which we think we have all the answers inside of ourselves, to learn a little humility and to be dependent upon your truth and your word and your spirit to make us into your image, Father. And we just commit ourselves and recommit ourselves to that truth. And we ask this in Christ's name.